All right, welcome to our next lesson. So at this point, we're going to be starting into basically, say, like a four-part lesson, or at least 4 videos for one lesson on the causes of World War I. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time in class on this. I have a few simulations I'd like to put into with it. Sorry, I won't be able to put as much into these content lessons. So I'll just be trying to sum it up as best as I can. But what are the causes of World War I? If you're looking at the graphic on the PowerPoint there that I have showing, there's tons of different stuff going on. But you can boil it down to 4 things. Those 4 things are, if I can get them brought up. Yeah. Number 1, imperialism, militarism, nationalism, and entangling alliances. So, like everything you see in that graphic on the side and anything else anybody else talks about World War I about why it started basically boils down to these 4 things. Although these 4 things also kind of come into each other as well. I'll talk about that as we go along. The first cause we're going to talk about, at least in this video lesson, is imperialism. Now, I use the term imperialism a lot in this class. I kind of have to in a wars class, and we're talking about going into World War I. But a lot of my students don't know this, so just covering a little bit of basics, or at least knowing what it is. Imperialism is simply the idea or the process of building an empire. Again, one more time, the process of building an empire. Now, throughout methods, well, throughout most of human history, it's basically done through military conquest. But you also could say they could happen through, well, dominating political and or economic control over other nations, essentially. Which means that you're not necessarily moving your armies in, but you're controlling them through some means where they pretty much have to do what you tell them to. And therefore, you're building this empire, whether through direct control or indirect control, you have control of things. So, now, of course, this idea, especially today, when you use the term imperialism, it has a negative connotation to it. That's just a quote I like to bring up. If it makes sense, great. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. You can pause it and read it if you'd like. But when it comes to imperialism is things that definitely has negative connotation for very good reason. It's not nice to go in and take other people out. Why can't everybody just stay on their side of the fence type thing? You don't hurt me and I won't hurt you. Or why can't we all just get along? But that being said, well, it's been a normal part of human history for as long as there's been really human history. This concept of territorial expansion. And it comes down to a few different things. Probably the biggest one is this idea of safety. Oh, of course there's the idea of power, yes. But usually they begin with this idea of safety. Like, in order for me to feel safe, I got to take care of you because you're a threat to me in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of times it'll start off like something like that between tribes or rival civilizations, different city-states, however you want to put it throughout history. But then, of course, you get this idea where someone's in charge and they can just I want more power, I need more, and that can build it up as well. And, of course, that's one of the major reasons why I have a negative connotation to imperialism. Now, again, this class is about just the world wars, World War I and World War II mainly. And so as we're talking about imperialism, there is a time period just before we get to World War I, which is called the Age of Imperialism. But please understand that this concept of imperialism has been around for all time, ever since there's been organized societies. I guess you could say back to the Acadians, when you really get the first world conquerors in place over 4,000 years ago. It's in Mesopotamia, by the way. It just keeps happening over and over again, and it just seems like it's a normal thing. In fact, the question I asked that I have you guys answering in your Bellworks or your class starters is, why do you think this idea of territorial expansion has been around and considered normal for pretty much throughout all of world history? It's a bit of a hard question to answer. In a way, we just kind of take it as it's just the way things are even to this day. We look at history, we watch movies, it's just like, well, it happens. But then we get into why. Well, at least when we're talking about imperialism in the 1800s leading into the early 1900s, just before World War I hits, which we call the Age of Imperialism, although again, not the only age of imperialism, but what sets apart this time is it's the first time we've seen it go all over the world. This isn't the Roman Empire controlling, mostly the Mediterranean world and parts of the Middle East. and into Northern Europe and things like that, or I should say Western and Central Europe into the British Isles. It's not like the various different Chinese dynasties controlling all of the Middle Kingdom and expanding out, but they're still staying in their regions. For the first time, mainly because of technology, and then as you could say, consequence of the age of exploration, just knowing about the world at this point. This is the first time where we see the world coming under control of various European powers. There's pretty much European powers, with the exception of Japan, that are in this expansion mode, just taking what they can get. So, but the justifications for this. Well, first one goes into what the justification has been for forever. Survival of the fittest, at least that's a social Darwinistic term. But that was a justification that was used for the reason why you need to expand in there. If I'm not doing it, someone else will, and they'll gobble me up as well. So we need to show that that we can do this. We can survive this competition, this world competition. Then you get in this idea of divine right. Again, this is one that's been around for forever. Basically, God told me to. Or whichever religion's God we're talking about, in the name of Zeus type of thing. I conquer thee. So, insert religion there, basically. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about, at least justification used for imperialism of these wide expanding empires, isn't really an initial reason for it, but becomes a reason over time, and that is what becomes known as white man's burden. Now, especially I guess in the times we're living right now, seems a bit not a good thing to say there. Definitely seems more on the racist side of things, but that is the term that was used. And actually, the political cartoon I have showing is a cartoon that's actually basically lambasting or making fun of, just really being critical of the concept of white man's burden. Like, okay, you're going to bring everybody else up into a better civilization, so therefore you have the right to conquer them. Anyways, but that's one way to look at white man's burden. The other way to look at white man's burden is if you just take away the whole concept of saying it's the white man, then just leave the term burden. Well, you had a lot of people who realize, I have a good life. I feel like it is my duty, and then maybe even God wants me to go out and help other people. So you get hundreds of thousands of people and that would just give up their lives, mostly all Europeans here, hence the name white man's burden here. But they go start charities, they go on missions, they start up orphanages, trying to make the world a better place. There's a lot of things we can get into with that. I'm not going to go into all the positive and negative effects of that. But basically, a lot of people feeling like they're doing a good job for the world, and that essentially God made it enabled them to be able to lift the world up and make it a better place because European countries controlled all the world and made it easier to get to other areas of the world and things like that. So this became another justification for imperialism. Take that as you will. Okay, but moving on. Okay, this is the best map I could find, at least to put onto the PowerPoint. Not the greatest, I'll explain why in a second. But what I'm trying to show you here is that when it comes down to imperialism, at least what's going on with the age of imperialism leading up into World War I, is most all of the world has been claimed by European powers. You can try to tell who's who there. It's kind of hard to, I know. It doesn't really say, but the big empires, you definitely see Russia easy enough, but Britain really is the largest empire. Germany has their territories. France is fairly large. Heck, the Netherlands, or Holland, whichever you want to call them at this point, is quite large as well. But what I'm getting at is that you get to this point where pretty much every inch of the world is already claimed. Like the areas in this map where it's saying they're not claimed, well, they are, or they were. For instance, in the Americas, like Central America and South America they were claimed by Spain and Portugal at one point, and a few of the other countries like Great Britain and France, but mostly Spain and Portugal. Areas in the middle of the map, well, that's the Ottoman Empire. In Eastern Europe, well, that's the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Those are empires already in place. And China. Yes, China was its own country at the time. You had the Qing dynasty in place. But they were heavily influenced by the Europeans, where the Europeans were running the show in different areas. Britain really had a good swath of both the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys, the core rivers of China, under their control. If you've heard of the Opium Wars, anyways, I won't go into too much in there, but yeah, British have a lot of control. French have a lot of control of the southern area. The Portuguese have been there forever. This is the reason why, like, Hong Kong forever was part of the United Kingdom, part of Britain, even up to this day, until they handed it back to China. They handed it back to the Chinese government. Russia had a large influence in here. Even Japan and Germany had major influential areas of China where they just basically controlled things. So even though China, yes, was its own country technically, it was still being dominated by other powers, mostly European. So at least the last thing I want to say before we're done with this video lesson is that because every inch of the world has basically been claimed or was claimed at some point, there just wasn't anything left to go off of. And so if you're a new empire coming onto the scene, aka Germany, and you feel like we deserve a bigger empire, well, now you're at a point where the only way to get it is to take it away from someone else. And so that's the tension. That's why imperialism is a cause of World War I. This is a negative reason for imperialism, or a very negative aspect of imperialism. Like, well, if there's nothing else left to take, then I deserve to take it from someone else. And that was a big part of why you have a lot of countries getting there thinking, maybe I can get more of the pie. And the idea of like a section of the world for us, I deserve that. Or we deserve that, I should say. And then you have others like Great Britain and France and Russia, like, well, we got a lot of the world so far, and we're not willing to give it up, and we wouldn't mind getting more ourselves. And that's the state of the world going into World War I, and why imperialism, and especially this negative connotation of imperialism, is a definite cause of World War I. And I will see you in part 2 when we start talking about militarism.